Hey there, this is Barry from Barry J, and I have been in my sewing room for like a week making lined pinch pleat curtains. This is one of them, almost done. I've just got to do the tacking on them, so they turn out really beautiful. But what I've discovered is the hardest part about making lined pinch pleat curtains, especially for a big long bank of windows where you want everything to be nice and even, is the planning and the cutting. So you need to do some math to do your pleats. And so the first part of this video is a Google sheet showing you exactly how I planned out my pleats for a single curtain. So let's go ahead and get started. To curtain pleat math 101. So we are going to be making triple pinch pleat curtains, and I have put together a little bit of a spreadsheet to figure out exactly how I need to do it. For me, I'm a really visual person and I need to just see it all written out. Plus, if you're making curtains for an entire bank of windows, you absolutely want to have everything come out equal so they line up when you hang them. So keeping everything straight in the spreadsheet is a really good way to go. So here I've marked, this is the middle dining room window. It's actually flanked by two other windows, so it meets up with other curtains. So that's something to keep in mind as we continue here. So our window measures 48 inches, and I'm going to split it and have two curtains that should come out somewhere around 24 inches. It could be a little bit more, and we can have a little bit more fullness depending on the math. So let's go ahead and do the math. So what I did here is I created a little bit of a model. Your curtains need to end with spaces on each end. Now we know that these spaces butt up to other curtains that also have spaces at the end. So if I did what my full space allowance is at each end, I would end up with 6.5-inch spaces, and that would look pretty big. And we can overlap them. I can do lots of things. I could tack them back. But what I'd like it to be is that they kind of butt up to each other and they're close to that 3.25. So what I did is I put 2-inch spaces at the end and figured they would overlap a little bit in the centers. So I know that all my other curtains in this bank of windows, I'm doing 4-inch pleats and 3.25-inch spaces. So I've got my space pleat and I've got it visually laid out here. And then I've numbered them so I know how many spaces and how many pleats. Right? So I know I have 9 spaces and I have 8 pleats. Now, 2 of those spaces are different sizes. So what I've done is I've gone over here and I've done the math. Let's call these the end spaces. And I have 2 of those. So I have 2 end spaces. Then each of those are 2 inches, which adds up to 4 inches. Then I have 7 other spaces at 3.25 inches, and I've done the formula here. 3.25 times 7 is 22.75. 8 times 4, we have 8 pleats, and they're each 4 inches, and that adds up to 32. Now each side will be hemmed 1/2 inch, so that's 1 inch. Now, our fabric is going to be longer than our lining, which means that the fabric will turn in towards the lining when it's all finished. And you'll see that when we go ahead and we sew. But the lining, then we need to allow another 3 inches. So that's a total for these hems of 4 inches. So my total cut width is the sum of that, 62.75. Now, I want to know where I'm going to finish out here. So I want to know what it's going to be at its actual finished sewn width on the window. So I'm going to subtract the pleats and the hem. So the pleats are 32 and the hem is 4. So I'm subtracting 36 and that gives me 26.75, which is close enough for me to where I'm going to need it to be about the 24 inches. It'll give it a little bit more fullness. I can overlap those ends. It will look perfect. Okay, so we also know this is the last, well, one of the last bits are the detail of our measurements that we need to know because we're gonna have to figure out our length too. Our width of our fabric that I bought is 54 inches. You'll find all sorts of different widths of fabric. They could go up to 60, some can be shorter. So mine is 54. So what I've done here is I've taken the total cut width that I need, 62.75, and I've done a little math to the side here. My 62.75 is what I need it to finish being cut at. And I know my width of fabric is 54 inches. So I've subtracted 54 from 62.75 and I've come up with 8.75. Now, of course, I will also be seaming that at 1/2 inch. So that's 1 inch because each side gets 1/2 inch. So I need an extra bit of 9.75. So that's how much extra fabric I need. Now, I could just do my width of fabric and sew together 9.75 inches. However, if that ended up in the middle of a space or at the center of a pleat, that wouldn't work out for me. So I would need to figure out exactly where this 9.75 inch seam is going to land. And it's going to land, so we've got 6, 7, 8, 9.25. It is going to land somewhere in this pleat. And that is okay for me because I could put that just in the pleat and it will work out where it's hidden. So that works out, and I don't need to adjust any of this. What you could do is if you need an extra inch, you subtract an inch from the width of the fabric and do an extra, do 10.75. So when you are working on your pleat math, you'll figure out where that seam needs to be, and it always needs to be not quite in the center of a pleat. All right, so we've got that all settled, and this is what I'm going to be cutting. I'm going to be cutting a width of the fabric and 9.75 extra. Now let's figure out the length. So we've got the fabric. I want my length to finish at 40 inches. I know that from my window. So my hem is going to be 8 inches. The header piece that goes in it is 2 inches, and the hem on that is 1.5 inches. So I need a total extra of 10.5, which gives me a length of the fabric at 50.5 inches. Now for the lining length, first off, the lining cut size is going to be 3 inches less than the fabric cut size. That we know. So we've got 59.75 width for the lining. The lining length, we're not going to count the header part because what we do is we put the raw edge of the lining just under where the header is. Then we fold the header over. And again, you'll see this when we sew, we fold the header over. So we're not going to need an extra for the header bit. What we need extra for is a hem, and your hem on your lining will be 6 inches. It'll be less than what your bit is for what your hem is for your fabric. And so that comes out to 45 inches. So what I did here is I want my lining length to come out to 39 inches so that it's 1 inch shorter than the finished length of the fabric, because we don't want our lining and our fabric to line up and you can visually end up seeing the hem of the lining from the outside of the fabric. So we want it to be 1 inch shorter, at least 1 inch shorter. So 39 is where we want it to land, and then we've added a hem of 36 inches. We've got a 45-inch cut length there. So now I've got this all marked out very clearly so I can see exactly what I need to cut for each thing. So I hope that helps you with your pleat math. Here's a little trick for matching up your pattern when you're putting 2 pieces of fabric together. So what I've done here is I've taken the pattern and I've matched it up and I've folded it under. Let's go over here. I folded it under like that. So that's matched up. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take a little washable Elmer's school glue. Keep that matched. Dry iron. And glue that on. And I'll do that all the way down. Then once I'm done doing that, I'm going to take it over to the sewing machine. I'm going to sew those 2 pieces together. And I'll use that crease that I just made as my guideline. So this crease here that I've already made I'll sew straight down that. And then when you open it up, voila, you'll have matching seams. Okay, so I have my panel width all put together already. And the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to hem the bottom. So it's going to be an 8-inch turn up all together. And so that's 4 and 4 and 4. And I like to mark it with a iron erasable Frixion pen. And so I'm just marking my 4 inches. And I'm actually looking more closely at the pattern than I am after I kind of marked my first line. I'm looking more at the pattern to make sure that when I fold this up, the pattern matches along the bottom. Because sometimes, you know, your bottom cut can be a little rickety or the fabric stretches. So it's really important to kind of look where you are lining it up on your pattern. So I'm marking more pattern related than I am marking the 4 inches. It'll all work out in the end, doing it this way. Okay, I've got this pressed on 1 4-inch, and then I'm gonna roll it up, and I can actually see the stripes through, so I'm really matching that up. And when I'm all done pressing this, I'm gonna pin the heck out of it. And again, watch your pattern at the bottom. That's very helpful. I'm now sewing this hem, and I'm using the blunt end of my seam ripper here because what happens as you sew linen is it sometimes stretches out. So this helps you create little micro pleats as you're going through the machine. So here's what I'm doing. Now you can see how, as I've gotten to the end, it's nice and even. Of course, always go ahead and give it a good steamy press after you sew. Now I'm going ahead and pressing the lining seam up 3 and 3, so it's a shorter hem than you don't need as much of a deep hem on the lining. So do that. Okay, now I'm working on the header of the curtain, and first thing you do is you're going to iron the top edge in 1/2 inch, and that is your seam allowance. And then we're going to use this very heavy crinoline type material. It's called buckram, and it's a 2-inch tape that I'm using because I'm doing cafe curtains. If I was doing longer curtains, I would probably do a 3.5-inch tape, but I'm doing a 2-inch tape for cafe curtains. All right, now I've got that folded over, and I like to glue my buckram down because I don't like all the pins at the top. So I'm taking my buckram and I'm putting it in the crease, and I took a little Elmer's washable school glue. I put a little thin line there, and I'm going to bend that down, and I'm going to insert that into that crease there. And as I go along, I'm just gonna take a dry iron and dry that. You don't want to use a steam iron because it will be sticky, and you definitely don't want it sticky when you go in your machine. So I'm just going to go ahead and do this entire edge like that, and then I'll show you the next step. Next, you want to turn this up nice and even, nice and straight, and nice and taut, and give it a press so you have a crease line to look at from the front when we put the pin the lining on. That is in the next step. All right. Our next bit. So I've already hemmed my lining. Remember in the pleat math video, I told you it was going to be a 6-inch total hem, turned up 3 and 3. And I also told you that the lining is shorter than the fabric. So you can see that here, shorter on each end. But still and yet, what I'm going to do is I'm going to line up the lining to the crease that I just made. This is the buckram underneath. And then I'm going to pull it to the end, and I'm going to pin it all the way down. And it should end up about 1 inch above the end of the curtain. Then I'm going to come to this side, and I'm going to pull it over to the end of this, even though I've got the extra fabric, and I'm going to pin it the same way I did on this end. And then I'll go to the machine and I'll sew a 1/2 inch seam allowance on each side. Now back at the ironing board, I have the curtain placed on the ironing board, still inside out, and I am ironing the curtain towards the seam, towards the lining side. And I'll do the same thing on the other side. Now we're going to turn it right side out. And prior to sewing the side seams, I marked at the top the middles, the center of each panel, so the lining and the fabric. There's my pin. I'm going to match that up, those centers. Going to pin the centers together with the raw edge of the lining right underneath the buckram. Okay, now that I have that nice and pinned, I can show you what happens on these side seams. I'm going to pull this nice and tight and keep it up lined here. What happens is you have this crease on the edge of the fabric. Let's fold that in nice and neat. And your outside, from the outside, you can't see the lining. If you had the lining and the seam lined up right here, when you looked at the curtain from the side, you'd be able to see the lining. But this way, you've turned it to the inside, and it's a very nice finish. Now here is where you did that little zigzag stitch that's now on the inside of the curtain. And what you're going to do is you're going to fold that in, and you'll go ahead and do a blind hand stitch to miter that in. All right, we're working on the seam for the header. And what we've got is we've got this buckram tape up. We've got the raw edge of the lining lined up to the bottom of the buckram. And I cannot stress this enough. Make sure that you keep all of the lining all the way across at the top edge of the buckram. And I'm going to take the pins out. And you're going to want to crease that over and really make sure that that lining stays in place. What you don't want is that lining falling down. Keep that in place and give it a nice zhuzh with the iron. and then pin it in place. And when you pin, again, make sure that lining is nice and up and in there. Time to mark the pleats. I'm going to turn this over onto the right side. Now I've got myself a ruler and a Frixion pen. And however you decided to make your pleat widths, that's how you're going to mark. You're going to start with your space and you're going to move on. So starting over here, I'm marking my first space. And I'm marking it nice and straight to the end of the buckram, the end of the header. Then I'm going to do my pleats. And then I'll do a space, and so on and so forth. Once you have all your spaces and pleats marked, you're going to want to pin your pleats like this. So you're going to match up the first pleat line to the end of the pleat line. And you'll match each one all the way down. And then you're going to take it to the sewing machine. Now that you've got your pleats matched up with your heat erasable Frixion pen or some other type of marking tool, you take it over to the machine, and with those two marks matched up on each side, you're going to sew a straight line down to the buckram. And you will do that for each pleat. Now, of course, I'm erasing all my pen marks with heat. And I'm going to trim any threads I have. Now the next thing you're going to do is make your pleats. There's a couple different kinds of pleats, and this would be, if you would flatten your pleat here, if you're going to make a double pleat, you're going to just fold it, right? But I don't want a double pleat, I want a triple pleat. And so I'm going to carefully push down my pleat here all the way to the seam, my 1/3, and then my next third. And then the last one's a little fiddly. You just have to make sure you press it all the way down. That's important because you don't want to end up with, you see how this is much bigger than this side, so I got to make it even. So I'm going to fiddle around with it a little to get even sides. There we go. Now I'm going to take my needle and thread. I've already knotted it, and I'm going to start from the inside of the pleat, and I'm going to go to the outside. If I start from the inside of the pleat, that will hide where that thread is ended. And then I'm just going to go back and forth for a bit, maybe like 8 to 10 times. Get it nice and tight. And so I've got this just under the buckram and pretty far back into this pleat here. Once you have all of your pleats tacked, you're going to go to the back and you're going to grab your pin and you're going to put the pin through the buckram, but not into the outside of the fabric, just right next to this pleat, just almost in it. So it's going through that buckram, and the buckram is what is holding this in. That's why you have to have a nice stiff interfacing in there. So then you will hook on, when you go to hang, you'll hook it on your ring. Now, the nice thing about these pins is if for some reason you have a series of panels and they're not all hanging at quite neatly at the bottom and they're not quite this right length, you could take the pins and you can move them around. There's quite a lot that you could do when you have slight imperfections at your hem. Now, once you have your pleats finished, you're going to want to iron your both sides very well by putting it onto the ironing board open. So you'll iron your outside and your lining separately, and then you're going to accordion pleat it to have it held in place, and you'll just lay it flat or lay it over a railing for a day or so, or even just a couple hours, and that way it'll hang very nicely on your window. So that's it.